The owner of a patent enjoys a legal monopoly, which, other conditions being propitious, can be used for the attainment of monopoly prices. Beyond the field covered by the patent itself, a patent may render auxiliary services in the establishment and preservation of margin monopoly, where the primary institutional conditions for the emergence of such a monopoly prevail. We may assume that some world cartels would exist even in the absence of any government interference, which provides for other commodities the indispensable conditions required for the construction of a monopolistic combine. There are some commodities, for example diamonds and mercury, the supply of which is by nature limited to a few sources. The owners of these resources can easily be united for concerted action. But such cartels would play only a minor role in the setting of world production. Their economic significance would be rather small. The important place that cartels occupy in our time is an outcome of the interventionist policies adopted by the governments of all countries. The great monopoly problem mankind has to face today is not an outgrowth of the operation of the market economy. It is a product of purposive action on the part of governments. It is not one of the evils inherent in capitalism, as the demagogues trumpet. It is, on the contrary, the fruit of policies hostile to capitalism and intent upon sabotaging and destroying its operation. The classical country of the cartels was Germany. In the last decades of the 19th century, the German Reich embarked upon a vast scheme of Sozialpolitik. The idea was to raise the income and the standard of living of the wage earners by various measures of what is called pro-labor legislation, by the much glorified Bismarck plan of Social Security, and by labor union pressure and compulsion for the attainment of higher wage rates. The advocates of this policy defied the warnings of the economists. There is no such thing as economic law, they announced. The Hohenzollern Empire, which had defeated the emperors of Austria and of France, and before which the nations of the world trembled, was above any law. Its will was the supreme canon. In stark reality, the Sozialpolitik raised costs of production within Germany. Every progress of the alleged pro-labor legislation and every successful strike disarranged industrial conditions to the disadvantage of the German enterprises. It made it harder for them to outdo foreign competitors for whom the domestic events of Germany did not raise costs of production. If the Germans had been in a position to renounce the export of manufactures and to produce only for the domestic market, the tariff could have sheltered the German plants against the intensified competition of foreign business. They would have been in a position to reap higher prices. What the wage earner would have profited from the achievements of the legislature and the unions would have been absorbed by the higher prices he would have had to pay for the articles he bought. Real wage rates would have risen only to the extent the entrepreneurs could improve technological procedures and thereby increase the productivity of labor. The tariff would have rendered the Sozialpolitik harmless in preventing a spread of unemployment. But Germany is, and was already at the time Bismarck inaugurated his pro-labor policy, a predominantly industrial country. Its plants exported a considerable part of their total output. These exports enabled the Germans to import the foodstuffs and raw materials they could not grow in their own country, comparatively overpopulated and poorly endowed with natural resources as it was. As has been pointed out above, such a surplus production renders a protective tariff ineffective. Only cartels could free Germany from the catastrophic consequences of its progressive pro-labor policies. The cartels charged monopoly prices at home and sold abroad at cheaper prices. The cartels are the necessary accompaniment and upshot of a progressive labor policy, as far as it affects industries dependent on foreign markets. The cartels do not, of course, safeguard for the wage earners the illusory social gains which the labor politicians and the union leaders promise them. There is no means of raising wage rates for all those eager to earn wages above the height determined by the productivity of each kind of labor. What the cartels achieved was merely to counterbalance the apparent gains in nominal wage rates by corresponding increases in domestic commodity prices. But the most disastrous effect of minimum wage rates, permanent mass unemployment, was at first avoided. Germany was not the first country that resorted to pro-labor legislation and gave its labor unions a free hand to enforce minimum wage rates. Other countries had preceded Germany in this respect. But the opposition which these policies had encountered on the part of economists, reasonable statesmen, and businessmen had for many years put a check upon the progress of these destructive methods of government. For the most part, their alleged benefits did not grant the wage earners more than they had already won, without any interference on the part of the government, by the technological improvements which never cease under capitalism. When, in some cases, the government had gone a little farther, the propulsive evolution of business in a very short time made things even. But in later years, especially after the end of the First World War, all other nations adopted for their labor policies the thorough methods of the Germans. Again, the cartel had to supplement the pro-labor policies in order to conceal their futility and to postpone for a time their manifest fiasco. With all industries which cannot content themselves with the domestic market and are intent upon selling a part of their output abroad, the function of the tariff, in this age of government interference with business, is to enable the establishment of domestic monopoly prices. Whatever the purpose and the effects of tariffs may have been in the past, as soon as an exporting country embarks upon measures designed to increase the revenues of the wage earners or the farmers above the potential market rates, it must foster schemes which result in domestic monopoly prices for the commodities concerned. A national government's might is limited to the territory subject to its sovereignty. It has the power to raise domestic costs of production. It does not have the power to force foreigners to pay correspondingly higher prices for the products. If exports are not to be discontinued, they must be subsidized. The subsidy can be paid openly by the Treasury, or its burden can be imposed upon the consumers by the cartel's monopoly prices. The advocates of government interference with business ascribe to the state the power to benefit certain groups within the framework of the market by a mere fiat. In fact, this power is the government's power to foster monopolistic combines. The monopoly gains are the funds out of which the social gains are financed. As far as these monopoly gains do not suffice, the various measures of interventionism immediately paralyze the operation of the market. Mass unemployment, depression, and capital consumption appear. This explains the eagerness of all contemporary governments to foster monopoly in all those sectors of the market which are in some way or other connected with export trade. If a government does not or cannot succeed in attaining its monopolistic aims indirectly, it resorts to direct action. In the field of coal and potash, the imperial government of Germany established compulsory cartels. The American New Deal was prevented by the opposition of business from organizing the nation's great industries on an obligatory cartel basis. It succeeded better in some vital branches of farming with measures designed to restrict output for the sake of monopoly prices. A long series of agreements concluded between the world's most prominent governments aimed at the establishment of world market monopoly prices for various raw materials and foodstuffs. It is the avowed purpose of the United Nations to continue these plans. It is necessary to view this pro-monopoly policy of the contemporary governments as a uniform phenomenon in order to discern the reasons which motivated it. From the catalactic point of view, these monopolies are not uniform. The contractual cartels into which entrepreneurs enter in taking advantage of the incentive offered by protective tariffs are instances of margin monopoly. Where the government directly fosters monopoly prices, we are faced with instances of license monopoly. The factor of production by the restriction of the use of which the monopoly price is brought about is the license which the laws make a requisite for supplying the consumers. Such licenses may be granted in different ways. A. An unlimited license is granted to practically every applicant. This amounts to a state of affairs under which no license at all is required. B. Licenses are granted only to selected applicants. Competition is restricted. However, monopoly prices can emerge only if the licensees act in concert and the configuration of demand is propitious. C. There is only one licensee. The licensee, for example, the holder of a patent or a copyright, is a monopolist. If the configuration of the demand is propitious, and if the licensee wants to reap monopoly gains, he can ask monopoly prices. D. The licenses granted are limited. They confer upon the licensee only the right to produce or to sell a definite quantity in order to prevent him from disarranging the authority's scheme. The authority itself directs the establishment of monopoly prices. Finally, there are the instances in which a government establishes a monopoly for fiscal purposes. The monopoly gains go to the Treasury. Many European governments have instituted tobacco monopolies. Others have monopolized salt, matches, telegraph and telephone service, broadcasting, and so on. Without exception, every country has a government monopoly of the postal service. 10. Margin monopoly need not always owe its appearance to an institutional factor such as tariffs. It can also be produced by sufficient differences in the fertility or productivity of some factors of production. It has already been said that it is a serious blunder to speak of a land monopoly and to refer to monopoly prices and monopoly gains in explaining the prices of agricultural products and the rent of land. As far as history is confronted with instances of monopoly prices for agricultural products, it was license monopoly, fostered by government decree. However, the acknowledgment of these facts does not mean that differences in the fertility of the soil could never bring about monopoly prices. If the difference between the fertility of the poorest soil still tilled and the richest fallow fields available for an expansion of production were so great as to enable the owners of the already exploited soil to find an advantageous monopoly price within this margin, they could consider restricting production by concerted action in order to reap monopoly prices. But it is a fact that physical conditions in agriculture do not comply with these requirements. It is precisely on account of this fact that farmers longing for monopoly prices do not resort to spontaneous action, but ask for the interference of governments. In various branches of mining, conditions are often more propitious for the emergence of monopoly prices based on margin monopoly. 11. It has been asserted again and again that the economies of big-scale production have generated a tendency toward monopoly prices in the processing industries. Such a monopoly would be called, in our terminology, a margin monopoly. Before entering into a discussion of this topic, one must clarify the role an increase or decrease in the unit's average cost of production plays in the considerations of a monopolist searching for the most advantageous monopoly price. We consider a case in which the owner of a monopolized complementary factor of production, for example, a patent, at the same time manufactures the product P. If the average cost of production of 1 unit of P, without any regard to the patent, decreases with the increase in the quantity produced, the monopolist must weigh this against the gains expected from the restriction of output. If, on the other hand, cost of production per unit decreases with the restriction of total production, the incentive to embark upon monopolistic restraint is augmented. It is obvious that the mere fact that big-scale production tends as a rule to lower average costs of production is in itself not a factor driving toward the emergence of monopoly prices. It is, rather, a checking factor. What those who blame the economies of big-scale production for the spread of monopoly prices are trying to say is that the higher efficiency of big-scale production makes it difficult or even impossible for small-scale plants to compete successfully. A big-scale plant could, they believe, resort to monopoly prices with impunity, because small business is not in a position to challenge its monopoly. Now, it is certainly true that in many branches of the processing industries it would be foolish to enter the market with the high-cost products of small, inadequate plants. A modern cotton mill does not need to fear the competition of old-fashioned distaffs. Its rivals are other, more or less adequately equipped mills. But this does not mean that it enjoys the opportunity of selling at monopoly prices. There is competition between big businesses, too. If monopoly prices prevail in the sale of the products of big-size business, the reasons are either patents or monopoly in the ownership of mines or other sources of raw material, or cartels based on tariffs. One must not confuse the notions of monopoly and of monopoly prices. Mere monopoly, as such, is catalactically of no importance if it does not result in monopoly prices. Monopoly prices are consequential only because they are the outcome of a conduct of business defying the supremacy of the consumers and substituting the private interests of the monopolist for those of the public. They are the only instance in the operation of a market economy in which the distinction between production for profit and production for use could to some extent be made, if one were prepared to disregard the fact that monopoly gains have nothing at all to do with profits proper. They are not a part of what catalactics can call profits. They are an increase in the price earned from the sale of the services rendered by some factors of production, some of these factors being physical factors, some of them merely institutional. If the entrepreneurs and capitalists, in the absence of a monopoly price constellation, abstain from expanding production in a certain branch of industry because the opportunities offered to them in other branches are more attractive, they do not act in defiance of the wants of the consumers. On the contrary, they follow precisely the line indicated by the demand as expressed on the market. The political bias which has obfuscated the discussion of the monopoly problem has neglected to pay attention to the essential issues involved. In dealing with every case of monopoly prices, one must first of all raise the question of what obstacles restrain people from challenging the monopolists. In answering this question, one discovers the role played in the emergence of monopoly prices by institutional factors. It is nonsense to speak of conspiracy with regard to the deals between American firms and German cartels. If an American wanted to manufacture an article protected by a patent owned by Germans, he was compelled by the American law to come to an arrangement with German business. 12. A special case is what may be called the failure monopoly. In the past, capitalists invested funds in a plant designed for the production of the article P. Later events proved the investment a failure. The prices which can be obtained in selling P are so low that the capital invested in the plant's inconvertible equipment does not yield a return. It is lost. However, these prices are high enough to yield a reasonable return for the variable capital to be employed for the current production of P. If the irrevocable loss of the capital invested in the inconvertible equipment is written off on the books, and all corresponding alterations are made in the accounts, the reduced capital working in the conduct of the business is by and large so profitable that it would be a new mistake to stop production altogether. The plant works at full capacity, producing the quantity Q of P and selling the unit at the price S. But conditions may be such that it is possible for the enterprise to reap a monopoly gain by restricting output to Q divided by 2 and selling the unit of P at the price of 3S. Then the capital invested in the inconvertible equipment no longer appears completely lost. It yields a modest return, namely the monopoly gain. This enterprise now sells at monopoly prices and reaps monopoly gains, although the total capital invested yields little when compared with what the investors would have earned if they had invested in other lines of business. The enterprise withholds from the market the services which the unused production capacity of its durable equipment could render, and fares better than it would by producing at full capacity. It defies the orders of the public. The public would have been in a better position if the investors had avoided the mistake of immobilizing a part of their capital in the production of P. They would, of course, not get any P, but they would instead obtain those articles which they miss now because the capital required for their production has been wasted in the construction of an aggregate for the production of P. However, as things are now after this irreparable fault has been committed, they want to get more of P, and are ready to pay for it what is now its potential competitive market price, namely S. They do not approve, as conditions are now, the action of the enterprise in withholding an amount of variable capital from employment for the production of P. This amount certainly does not remain unused. It goes into other lines of business and produces there something else, namely M. But as conditions are now, the consumers would prefer an increase of the available quantity of P to an increase in the available quantity of M. The proof is that in the absence of a monopolistic restriction of the capacity for the production of P, as it is under given conditions, the profitability of a production of the quantity Q of S would be such that it would pay better than an increase in the quantity of the article M produced. There are two distinctive features of this case. First, the monopoly prices paid by the buyers are still lower than the total cost of production of P would be if full account is taken of the whole input of the investors. Second, the monopoly gains of the firm are so small that they do not make the total venture appear a good investment. It remains malinvestment. It is precisely this fact that constitutes the monopolistic position of the firm. No outsider wants to enter its field of entrepreneurial activity because the production of P results in losses. Failure monopoly is by no means a merely academic construction. It is, for instance, actual today in the case of some railroad companies. But one must guard against the mistake of interpreting every instance of unused production capacity as a failure monopoly. Even in the absence of monopoly, it may be more profitable to employ variable capital for other purposes instead of expanding a firm's production to the limit fixed by the capacity of its durable inconvertible equipment. Then the output restriction complies precisely with the state of the competitive market and the wishes of the public. 13. Local monopolies are, as a rule, of institutional origin, but there are also local monopolies which originate out of conditions of the unhampered market. Often the institutional monopoly is designed to deal with the monopoly which came into existence or would be likely to come into existence without any authoritarian interference with the market. A catalactic classification of local monopolies must distinguish three groups: margin monopoly, limited space monopoly, and license monopoly. A local margin monopoly is characterized by the fact that the barrier preventing outsiders from competing on the local market and breaking the monopoly of the local sellers is the comparative height of transportation costs. No tariffs are needed to grant limited protection to a firm which owns all the adjacent natural resources required for the production of bricks against the competition of far distant tile works. The costs of transportation provide them with a margin in which, the configuration of demand being propitious, an advantageous monopoly price can be found. So far, local margin monopolies do not differ catalactically from other instances of margin monopoly. What distinguishes them, and makes it necessary to deal with them in a special way, is their relation to the rent of urban land on the one hand, and their relation to city development on the other. Let us assume that an area A, offering favorable conditions for the aggregation of an increasing urban population, is subject to monopoly prices for building materials. Consequently, building costs are higher than they would be in the absence of such a monopoly. But there is no reason for those weighing the pros and cons of choosing the location of their homes and their workshops in A to pay higher prices for the purchase or the renting of such houses and workshops. These prices are determined on the one hand by the corresponding prices in other areas, and on the other by the advantages which settling in A offers when compared with settling somewhere else. The higher expenditure required for construction does not affect these prices. Its incidence falls upon the yield of land. The burden of the monopoly gains of the sellers of building materials falls on the owners of the urban soil. These gains absorb proceeds which, in their absence, would go to these owners. Even in the not very likely case that the demand for houses and workshops is such as to make it possible for the owners of the land to attain monopoly prices in selling and leasing, the monopoly prices of the building materials would affect only the proceeds of the landowners, not the prices to be paid by the buyers or tenants. The fact that the burden of the monopoly gains reverts to the price of urban employment of the land does not mean that it does not check the growth of the city. It postpones the employment of the peripheral land for the expansion of the urban settlement. The instant at which it becomes advantageous for the owner of a piece of suburban land to withdraw it from agricultural or other non-urban employment and to use it for urban development appears at a later date. Now, arresting a city's development is a two-edged action. Its usefulness for the monopolist is ambiguous. He cannot know whether future conditions will be such as to attract more people to A, the only market for his products. One of the attractions a city offers to newcomers is its bigness, the multitude of its population. Industry and commerce tend toward centers. If the monopolist's action delays the growth of the urban community, it may direct the stream toward other places. An opportunity may be missed which never comes back. Greater proceeds in the future may be sacrificed to comparatively small short-run gains. It is therefore at least questionable whether the owner of a local margin monopoly in the long run serves his own interests well by embarking upon selling at monopoly prices. It would often be more advantageous for him to discriminate between the various buyers. He could sell at higher prices for construction projects in the central parts of the city and at lower prices for such projects in peripheral districts. The range of local margin monopoly is more restricted than is generally assumed. Limited space monopoly is the outcome of the fact that physical conditions restrict the field of operation in such a way that only one or a few enterprises can enter it. Monopoly emerges when there is only one enterprise in the field, or when the few operating enterprises combine for concerted action. It is sometimes possible for two competing trolley companies to operate in the same streets of a city. There were instances in which two or even more companies shared in supplying the residents of an area with gas, electricity, and telephone service. But even in such exceptional cases, there is hardly any real competition. Conditions suggest to the rivals that they combine, at least tacitly. The narrowness of the space results, one way or another, in monopoly. In practice, limited space monopoly is closely connected with license monopoly. It is practically impossible to enter the field without an understanding with the local authorities controlling the streets and their subsoil. Even in the absence of laws requiring a franchise for the establishment of public utility services, it would be necessary for the enterprises to come to an agreement with the municipal authorities. Whether or not such agreements are to be legally described as franchises is unimportant. Monopoly, of course, need not result in monopoly prices. It depends on the special data of each case whether or not a monopolistic public utility company could resort to monopoly prices. But there are certainly cases in which it can. It may be that the company is ill-advised in choosing a monopoly price policy and that it would better serve its long-run interests by lower prices, but there is no guarantee that a monopolist will find out what is most advantageous for him. One must realize that limited space monopoly may often result in monopoly prices. In this case, we are confronted with a situation in which the market process does not accomplish its democratic function. Private enterprise is very unpopular with our contemporaries. Private ownership of the means of production is especially disliked in those fields in which limited space monopoly emerges, even if the company does not charge monopoly prices, and even if its business yields only small profits or results in losses. A public utility company is, in the eyes of the interventionist and socialist politicians, a public enemy. The voters approve of any evil inflicted upon it by the authorities. It is generally assumed that these enterprises should be nationalized or municipalized. Monopoly gains, it is said, must never go to private citizens. They should go to the public funds exclusively. The outcome of the municipalization and nationalization policies of the last decades was, almost without exception, financial failure, poor service, and political corruption. Blinded by their anti-capitalistic prejudices, people condone poor service and corruption, and for a long time did not bother about the financial failure. However, this failure is one of the factors which contributed to the emergence of the present-day crisis of interventionism. 14. It is customary to characterize traditional labor union policies as monopolistic schemes, aiming at the substitution of monopoly wage rates for competitive wage rates. However, as a rule, labor unions do not aim at monopoly wage rates. A union is intent upon restricting competition on its own sector of the labor market in order to raise its wage rates. But restriction of competition and monopoly price policy must not be confused. The characteristic feature of monopoly prices is the fact that the sale of only a part, lowercase p, of the total supply, uppercase P, available, nets higher proceeds than the sale of uppercase P. The monopolist earns a monopoly gain by withholding uppercase P minus lowercase p from the market. It is not the height of this gain that marks the monopoly price situation as such, but the purposive action of the monopolists in bringing it about. The monopolist is concerned with the employment of the whole stock available. He is equally interested in every fraction of this stock. If a part of it remains unused, it is his loss. Nonetheless, he chooses to have a part unused, because under the prevailing configuration of demand, it is more advantageous for him to proceed in this way. It is the peculiar state of the market that motivates his decision. The monopoly, which is one of the two indispensable conditions of the emergence of monopoly prices, may be, and is as a rule, the product of an institutional interference with the market data. But these external forces do not directly result in monopoly prices. Only if a second requirement is fulfilled is the opportunity for monopolistic action set. It is different in the case of simple supply restriction. Here, the authors of the restriction are not concerned with what may happen to the part of the supply they bar from access to the market. The fate of the people who own this part does not matter to them. They are looking only at that part of the supply which remains on the market. Monopolistic action is advantageous for the monopolist only if total net proceeds at a monopoly price exceed total net proceeds at the potential competitive price. Restrictive action is always advantageous for the privileged group, and disadvantageous for those whom it excludes from the market. It always raises the price per unit, and therefore the total net proceeds of the privileged group. The losses of the excluded group are not taken into account. It may happen that the benefits which the privileged group derives from the restriction of competition are much more lucrative for them than any imaginable monopoly price policy could be. But this is another question. It does not blot out the catalactic differences between these two modes of action. The prevailing labor union policies are restrictive and not monopoly price policies. The unions are intent upon restricting the supply of labor in their field without bothering about the fate of those excluded. They have succeeded in every comparatively underpopulated country in erecting immigration barriers. Thus they preserve their comparatively high wage rates. The excluded foreign workers are forced to stay in their countries, in which the marginal productivity of labor and consequently wage rates are lower. The tendency toward an equalization of wage rates which prevails under free mobility of labor from country to country is paralyzed. On the domestic market, the unions do not tolerate the competition of non-unionized workers and admit only a restricted number to union membership. Those not admitted must go into less remunerative jobs or must remain unemployed. The unions are not interested in the fate of these people. Even if a union takes over the responsibility for its unemployed members and pays them out of the contributions of its employed members unemployment doles not lower than the earnings of the employed members, its action is not a monopoly price policy. For the unemployed union members are not the only people wronged by the union's policy of substituting higher rates for the potential lower market rates. The interests of those excluded from membership are not taken into account. The mathematical treatment of the theory of monopoly prices. Mathematical economists have paid special attention to the theory of monopoly prices. It looks as if monopoly prices would be a chapter of catalactics for which mathematical treatment is more appropriate than it is for other chapters of catalactics. However, the services which mathematics can render in this field are rather poor too. With regard to competitive prices, mathematics cannot give more than a mathematical description of various states of equilibrium and of conditions in the imaginary construction of the evenly rotating economy. It cannot say anything about the actions which would finally establish these equilibria, and this evenly rotating system, if no further changes in the data were to occur. In the theory of monopoly prices, mathematics comes a little nearer to the reality of action. It shows how the monopolist could find out the optimum monopoly price, provided he had at his disposal all the data required. But the monopolist does not know the shape of the curve of demand. What he knows is only points at which the curves of demand and supply intersected one another in the past. He is therefore not in a position to make use of the mathematical formulas in order to discover whether there is any monopoly price for his monopolized article, and if so, which of various monopoly prices is the optimum price. The mathematical and graphical disquisitions are therefore no less futile in this sector of action than in any other sector. But at least they schematize the deliberations of the monopolist, and do not, as in the case of competitive prices, satisfy themselves in describing a merely auxiliary construction of theoretical analysis, which does not play a role in real action. Contemporary mathematical economists have confused the study of monopoly prices. They consider the monopolist not as the seller of a monopolized commodity, but as an entrepreneur and producer. However, it is necessary to distinguish the monopoly gain clearly from entrepreneurial profit. Monopoly gains can only be reaped by the seller of a commodity or a service. An entrepreneur can reap them only in his capacity as seller of a monopolized commodity, not in his entrepreneurial capacity. The advantages and disadvantages which may result from the fall or rise in cost of production per unit with increasing total production increase or diminish the monopolist's total net proceeds and influence his conduct. But the catalactic treatment of monopoly prices must not forget that the specific monopoly gain stems, with due allowance made to the configuration of demand, only from the monopoly of a commodity or a right. It is this alone which affords to the monopolist the opportunity to restrict supply without fear that other people can frustrate his action by expanding the quantity they offer for sale. Attempts to define the conditions required for the emergence of monopoly prices by resorting to the configuration of production costs are vain. It is misleading to describe the market situation resulting in competitive prices by declaring that the individual producer could sell at the market price also a greater quantity than what he really sells. This is true only when two special conditions are fulfilled. The producer concerned, A, is not the marginal producer, and expanding production does not require additional costs which cannot be recovered in selling the additional quantity of products. Then, A's expansion forces the marginal producer to discontinue production. The supply offered for sale remains unchanged. The characteristic mark of the competitive price, as distinguished from the monopoly price, is that the former is the outcome of a situation under which the owners of goods and services of all orders are compelled to serve best the wishes of the consumers. On a competitive market, there is no such thing as a price policy of the sellers. They have no alternative other than to sell as much as they can at the highest price offered to them. But the monopolist fares better by withholding from the market a part of the supply at his disposal in order to make specific monopoly gains.